All right, welcome everybody to the July discussion of the Summer of Soil Book Club. So today we are going to be talking about this book, which is A World Without Soil by Jo Handelsman. And this is part of our theme for Summer of Soil. This is another book that kind of talks about the soil crisis and gives a bit of context and explanations, kind of more from, I would say, like a policy standpoint, maybe than our first book, which was a bit more about the history of how soil erosion has affected civilizations. So I'm really looking forward to talking about this, but first we'll do some quick introductions. I am Laura Williams. I am an associate professor in the Department of Biology at Providence College. And right below me, in no particular order, is Jess. Jess, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, hi, I'm Jess Lowry. I'm in Kelowna, BC, Canada, currently working as the Center for Scholarly Communication associate. And so I mostly just support graduate students and postdoctoral fellows on writing support for theses and publications and things like that. And the only thing I know about soil is from working for Nicole for research assistantship several years ago. But so I'm excited to hear more about this.
Fantastic. And then Joanna, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Joanna Klein, and I am taking a new position actually starting August 1st at the University of St. Thomas, which is in St. Paul, Minnesota. And so I'm currently at University of Northwestern, which is also in a suburb of St. Paul. So not a big move, but still a big move. I teach microbiology, have taught that for 19 years, and we'll be teaching that again at St. Thomas. And as Laura hinted at, I've been involved with Tiny Earth, which is this undergraduate research program that we incorporate into our microbiology courses. And so we collect soil and isolate bacteria from the soil and then look for antibiotic production from the bacteria. And so to think more about the soil is just really interesting. And of course, Jo Handelsman, the author of the book, is the founder of Tiny Earth. And so, met Jo, highly respected. And so it's really cool to read her passion about this topic that's not directly related to microbiology always, but just science policy. So.
Yes, agreed. And then Nicole, would you like to introduce yourself?
Certainly. I'm Nicole Suctio. I tweet as Old Dusty, and I'm in Prince George, BC, Canada, working as a part-time instructor at the University of Northern British Columbia, Prince George campus in the Department of Ecosystem Science and Management, but I'm mainly teaching biology things. So yes, Jess did work with me on some forest soil microbiome stuff, and had an opportunity to have some data survive going through the mother pipeline, as I recall once, which was great because then you could see how many things were living in there, which is a lot from the bacterial side. And I am happy that this is the second book in the year 2022 in our series that shouts out nitrogen fixing bacteria and also cyanobacteria towards the end, as well as a lot of other interesting biology and moving beyond sort of just erosion, but actually I'm sort of stoked that she had an entire chapter devoted to soil orders, which is a really hard thing to convey to a non-science looking public. So that's sort of one of the things I'm hyped about with this book.
Yeah. So thanks everybody for introducing yourselves. So our first book that we read this summer was called Dirt, the Erosion of Civilizations. And it was very much a kind of historical treatment of different periods and different civilizations, all along the thesis of civilizations will rise and fall depending on the health of their soil. I think that you could, Nicole, I think it's fair to summarize that book with that. We kind of hammered at that thesis throughout that book. This book is similar but different in interesting ways. She definitely emphasizes the importance of recognizing the challenge of soil erosion. I think there's a bit more of talking about what is soil, how do people think about soil who farm and whose livelihoods depend on soil, how do scientists think about soil, and then also starts to build in kind of ideas about soil stewardship, which I think is a really productive direction to go from this. I feel like, and maybe this is just me knowing that Jo Handelsman, and she mentions it in the book, but coming into this, I knew that she worked in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. And I feel like this reflects a policy mindset, a mindset of kind of trying to lay out in very accessible terms, here is the challenge, here is the background you need to know about the challenge, here are the ways that we should go forward. And I always sense that with policy, there always has to be a bit of a bit of hype and a bit of selling and a bit of and then it'll work and it'll be great and here we go. So you kind of always end on this note of kind of positivity of you can help us kind of address this. I'm not sure other people's, just as a kind of opening question, what are other people's thoughts on kind of the overall framework for the book? It struck me as kind of having a lot of policy thought at its core. I don't know if it struck people in a different way or if other folks kind of picked up on that too.
I get the sense that that's a little unavoidable when you have that sort of positionality with respects to science issues.
Yeah.
So I think there was a lot that was done in the book to balance this perhaps overly, I want to say Western science, there is a utilitarian narrative towards regaining some aspect of control with some highlights on colonization's effect on communities, indigenous communities that already understood their land well. Some framing of inequities that have happened as a result of that, misguided ideas about what soil management should be. I feel like the optimization or the optimism around no-till is one that is going to be a really hard one to sell to big agriculture. I mean, I'm probably just stating the obvious, but that is the big surmountable one in North America, of course.
And do you think that's because it's kind of baked into how industrial agriculture proceeds, kind of
and I don't I mean, it's very easy to move in the direction of demonizing those systems of production. They are bad for land. They are homogenizing, the types of genetics that we put down as plants for food for society, but remembering that ultimately in sort of these types of economies, we have the math of productivity. So the challenge of feeding the world, I know it's the big cliche, but how do we not, this is one of those areas where when you make, it's not one of those, it's many other things where if you start to have these dips in equitable redistribution while trying to rebuild the system, it's going to be very bad for some people, right? So it's it's very hard to actually think about what implementing policy looks like. And I think, to her credit, she made the last chapter of the book very short in terms of that, because there is this idea of an international imperative for soil conservation. But I think a lot of what she chose to do with highlighting other agricultural management systems that are not North American big ag is also a very gentle way of leading people to understand that local ecological and socio-ecological contexts are actually probably the way forward, with an endorsement by something to say this is a good stewardship, but letting people who understand the dynamics of that land as it is use that to get to the solutions that constitute stewardship.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm saying a lot that I feel is meandering, so I'm just going to stop here.
No, I think you're making good points about, you know, I think this is all coming from a very naive perspective on my part, but I feel like one of the challenges of policy is to simplify an extremely complex challenge to a point where your non-expert stakeholders and decision makers feel like they have a grasp of it and an ability to kind of gauge, you know, let's do this. And there's probably a lot that goes on behind the scenes to say, all right, of these possible strategies, we're gonna pitch this one, knowing that if everybody goes along with us and we implement it, there's going to be all kinds of extra stuff that happens on the margin. So kind of, that was all very generic, but I think in terms of kind of trying to come up with like an action plan moving forward for soil management and soil stewardship, it's probably difficult to just say, we'll let people locally figure out what's best. Because that doesn't, there's like nothing for policymakers to like seize on as this is the thing, and we're going to pass this bill that says we're going to do this thing, and then we'll be able to build from that. I don't know.
Exactly. But I mean, like in all the examples, I think in the second last chapter about sort of milpa systems and also Zuni agriculture, it was always framed with, here are the characteristics along an elevation gradient. Like this is working within some apparent scheme of regulation of that environment, whether it's completely understood or not, that persons who are very attentive to it could actually use. And like, it's actually really nice in the sense that like, there's a Western engineering, and then there's deeply understanding your ecosystem and making modifications you need to within it. So like it's understanding that everyone who's sort of attempting to work to have a consistent source of food, I guess, and a consistent source of soil is doing some aspect of manipulation, but there's some that acknowledge, I think, the parameters they work within, either through generations of living there or through what we do in sort of a Western problem solving utilitarian, here is a bulleted list of what we think we're going to be able to manipulate and hopefully.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I'll just put Joanna on the spot. So Joanna, I was kind of curious. I have to, so I teach the Tiny Earth curriculum as well, which Joanna knows. And I have to admit that because I don't have a good grounding in soil science, I really don't emphasize that very much. And part of my goal in choosing this theme for this summer is to try to build up that foundation of knowledge so that I can at least incorporate more of that. What's your kind of experience with talking about soil with students, either in the context of Tiny Earth or if it comes up outside of the context of that?
Yeah, I'm not terribly knowledgeable. So we've got this manual that we have for Tiny Earth instructors, and there is a kind of a chapter, a section on soil. And so I have my students, as they collect the soil, to try to say what horizon it's from, right? And there's just a paragraph or something in that lab manual about it. And I'm certainly no expert. And so they'll come in and ask me questions. I'm like, just make something up. Like, so it's not great, right? Admittedly. And so I started reading this right when I got the book, like the winter, I think. And so I haven't read those chapters real recently, but I learned something. And so I would agree with you that I'm hoping to be able to talk more about the soil in the future, and even for students to generate more hypotheses about being very deliberate about where they're collecting soil from.
Yes.
Like where, what horizon or what kind of vegetation or ecological niche are you getting it from, or what would you expect to see in it? But that's not something that I emphasize right now. Part of the problem is I've always done this in January, and so my students to get soil in January in Minnesota, like any of you that have winter, right? If they get soil, I'm happy. Like it's like a centimeter down. Like it's not in a
just handing out ice axes as they leave the lab. Like, here you go. Just chip away.
Yeah. So, you know, I've heard Jo give talks about soil. So sometimes, you know, at the 10-year research symposium, she'll talk about exactly what's in the book. So I've heard kind of her presentation a couple times. And so even some of the figures in the book are in the presentation. So I didn't get through the whole book. I kind of got bogged down in the soil erosion chapter and just, you know, the different countries. And I was kind of depressed when I read it. I'm like, I probably should just skip this chapter and move on to the next chapter, but I didn't quite finish it. But I do have kind of a general idea of, you know, where she, you know, the arc of the narrative. And interestingly, I lived for 9 years in Iowa. And so I just read last night how, you know, if Iowa were its own economy, it would be the 4th largest producer of corn and soybeans. And so I lived there. My husband grew up on a farm. His dad farmed corn, soybeans, and hogs, right? And so he converted completely to no-till. And so it's not a stretch for me, no-till. I think from my understanding, the problem is, you know, it's big ag, it's genetically engineered, you have to use the Roundup, it's, and so again, like, well, which is the worst evil? Like the soil erosion, the genetic engineering, GMOs. I also want to give a shout out to farmers. A lot of them, their work is very scientific and it's informed and they are being educated. And that's not all farmers, but you know, it's not hopeless, right? You know, a lot of the farming, you know, it's becoming big ag. And so, you know, it's fewer family farms like my father-in-law, but it revolutionized his process of planting. And my husband grew up walking beans and pulling weeds by hand, and now they don't have to.
Yeah. That's it's. We talked like last month. We talked a little bit about different people's kind of experiences with farming or agriculture, soil. So I'm from Indiana, so I'd mentioned that in the last discussion. So I felt like I actually hadn't seen the maps before. So Joanna, you were ahead of me because you'd seen them when she I guess when she showed it. But I really did find these maps where where she's showing the distribution of different types of soils really interesting, because it helps you start thinking about, well, why are the plains so well, you know, why do certain regions of the United States kind of become our big agricultural production regions? And you know, you think the answer would be obvious, that these are conditions that are best for agriculture, but it was still really interesting to kind of see these maps and think about the different types of soils. I see Luke's joined us. Hi, Luke. Jess or Luke, what I know, Jess, I know you said you made your way part of the way into the book. So from what you did have a chance to read, anything kind of jump out at you?
Yeah, I definitely saw like the policy discussions, and like they were that was kind of brought up or alluded to in the beginning, talking about kind of the complex I guess machinery that is agriculture, and just like how it all, I don't have a good understanding of how it works, but I think I got the sense that it was of its complexity, I guess, and like policy decisions being one of those big wicked problems like climate change, and kind of tying it into climate change. And so I found those things really helpful for kind of getting a sense of it. And then we also, like, I think during, you know, like throughout the pandemic and stuff, people generally don't have a good understanding of the supply chain. And I think that that's like fairly well demonstrated through everything we've seen. So I think that kind of connects to that issue. But yeah, I definitely, even just in a couple of chapters, learned a lot about about the processes. And yeah, I can see the connections that they're going to make later. So I'm curious to also keep reading, even though I didn't get through a lot.
I did think too, with the discussions in the early chapters of kind of different soils and why certain regions, you know, I was reading through it, and Ukraine ended up getting mentioned a few times because, I mean, and I based on the date of this and the date of the invasion by Russia, I don't think that, you know, this was published before that. So it was really interesting to see kind of, if you've been following the news about the, you know, why agriculture in Europe is extremely concerned about Ukrainian land and what's happening on the land, and in addition to the obvious human toll. And then the book kind of just walks through kind of, this is the type of soil that's a large part of Ukraine's land. And so they're the breadbasket of Europe. And that's a extremely important resource. And I thought it was just interesting to kind of see that coming up in the book, given what's happening now, and how destabilizing that is for not only Ukraine, but also Europe and folks that depend on Ukraine's agriculture. So that was interesting. Luke, anything that jumped out at you?
I finished it this morning. I don't have too many hot takes. I enjoyed it. I did think it did kind of a nice job of contextualizing a lot of the content from the last book. Mm-hmm. And so, like, really taking what that book talked about and putting it into our current situation and our current climate. And so I appreciated it for that. But yeah, I don't really have any strong opinions one way or the other than I frequently felt afraid when I was reading this book. But yeah, aside from that.
Yeah, I feel like it was I feel like this is, sometimes you read books, science books for the public, and you feel like the authors are attempting to be provocative or controversial, or they're trying to, you know, poke at you in some way. I feel like this book was not written with that kind of an approach. I think it was meant to be very kind of uncontroversial and very like, here's the situation. Here it reads like someone who, in addition to having policy experience, also has teaching experience, which is obviously the case. And so I think it's a good introduction to that. I was a little surprised there wasn't more microbiology. I guess it's not missing. I'm biased, so maybe that's just me wishing that there was more microbiology in it. I think I'm kind of curious why she didn't end up kind of talking more about Tiny Earth, for example, because it's the developing antibiotics from microbes that you find in the soil.
So what if you free associate on the fact that she is trained as a soil scientist? Does that change your thinking about this?
Maybe, but she's so closely involved in the microbiology aspect of the soil. I think there's a balance, right? You don't want to be introducing so much content that people are just lost in all the information you're trying to give them, rather than getting the message and then thinking about what to do. But here is why I'm thinking about it. And it is for the following reason, which is I am definitely going to try to incorporate more discussions of soil when I teach Tiny Earth in the fall, but the folks that take my classes are predominantly pre-health professions. And I can just watch their eyes just glaze over once you start talking about things that don't have anything to do with healthcare. That doesn't mean that I don't talk about things that don't have anything to do with healthcare. It means that it's just a bigger challenge to kind of get them to put the same level of engagement into that topic than they would if you can tie it to something that they perceive as being connected to their career, their pursuit of healthcare professions. So one of the reasons why Tiny Earth lands so well with them is because the main goal is to try to deal with or try to kind of provide other avenues for discovering new antibiotics. And once you tell them that, the pre-health profession students are just hooked. They're like, oh, yes, this is a crisis. We're going to do something about it. This is really great. I'm glad that we're doing this thing in lab that's connected to this. And that's kind of the way to get them invested in thinking about soil and thinking about soil as a community and thinking about why we don't want to lose kind of soil biodiversity and so forth. So I guess that's why I was a little surprised that that wasn't in here just a little bit more, because it is a good hook for folks who maybe aren't as convinced by, I think you should be convinced by the idea that we're desperately dependent on soil quality for our food. That seems like that should get people. But sometimes people still need something that's a little bit more like, I see. And also there's this other possibility for resources we could get, that we got to preserve our soil microbial diversity because they're doing other things for us too. I see people do that with like trying to encourage people to protect coral reef communities too. They'll say like, we get drugs out of coral reef communities, just to kind of try to like, see, it's useful, which might seem very mercenary, but is perhaps a useful way to get engagement from people who aren't interested by the other reasons. So maybe that's the reason why I was a little surprised that there wasn't a bit more microbiology in there. So yeah, I don't know.
As you were talking, I'm like, maybe if I revisited the soil part at the end of the research project. So rather than when they're collecting the soil, like now I'm really invested in this project. I've been through this whole arc. I've discovered something that inhibits other bacteria. And then say, well, what if you didn't find that because the soil is eroded or something like that? I'm just thinking of my own students. Yeah, they don't care about the soil. That's almost too early for them to know that they care so much about the arc of this project. So maybe
that's an interesting idea. Yeah. You could bookend almost, like talk about it at the beginning and then talk about it again at the end.
Talk about it a little bit and then revisit it. Isn't this valuable to look in different areas? Because look, the soil is different in different areas.
Well, not only that, but I think even if you showed them, like, as much as we all feel a certain way about stack of photographs of the soil microbiome, the point is there's a lot of stuff in there. So it's also that good. They do the work, and then you ask, like, why is it important to maybe be producing these natural products if this is your home?
Yeah, true.
In terms of competition, that kind of thing. Because I mean, they're trying to make their way. They're trying to survive like every other self-perpetuating thing on the planet. So yeah.
I do think after reading this, I was thinking, I know that I can do more at the beginning of teaching this to get them to think about soil as a vibrant, dynamic ecosystem and not just dirt, which I think is perhaps an achievable goal that would get them thinking beyond where they are now. I don't know about other folks when you encounter kind of the college student population, but at least here at Providence College, whenever I kind of casually ask groups of students if they go hiking or if they get a lot of outdoor time, this population of students really does not. They just don't go outside that much to do outdoors things. I know that's not unique to, I know that's not common for all college age students, because for example, my husband, he teaches at the University of Georgia, and they get a lot of, like folks who are from rural communities where they're farming, folks that go hunting, folks that have a big piece of, outdoor life is a big piece of what they do. So I know that's not I'm absolutely not saying that's a college student thing, but I think certain populations of students, depending on where you're getting them from, don't have much of a relationship with the outdoors. So part of what this seems really obvious, but as I was reading this, part of what I was thinking is I should probably just do the introductory, here's what Tiny Earth is about, outside. I should just march them all outside and be like, if it's a nice day, we're just gonna sit around on the grass and like actually look at soil and talk about what's in there. Because usually like a lot of people, I do kind of pre-lab stuff in the lab with the PowerPoints going, here's all the things you need to know. That alone, I think, might be useful for them to just really start thinking about what are we doing here. So
this is gonna go off topic, so like maybe
yes.
Not more than 2 minutes, but has anybody adapted Tiny Earth to like do some sampling out of Legacy columns? Because then you just like it's not soil, but it's lake sediment, which is
I'm not sure
a volume of, because that would be kind of an interesting point of engagement, because then students, assuming your column works, gets to watch this community develop,
yeah,
and then
true.
Sample and see like what's.
That's true. I just the visual of seeing the thing. Yeah. That's always the what is it? That's always the benefit that our macrobiologists have over us, is that they can be like, and here's your aquatic ecosystem. Look at the starfish. Look at the things. It's a little harder for us, but yeah, the Winogradzki column is a good idea for getting them to think about like what's happening, what are the different environments, who's interacting with who, and who's producing what, and how's that changing things. It's a dynamic system.
And to be fair, the climate change chapter, because they talked about potential manipulations in sort of a rice paddy field with respect to which direction you're going to drive the carbon cycles, or carbon dioxide reduction or carbon consumption. So it's still a hard sell, because cycles scare students a little. I don't know.
It's because it's got chemistry in it.
Exactly, right? But like, yeah, but the stories that she tells for that are very good.
Yeah.
Yeah. And they're like a relatable system, growing food, and she's very, very clear about like what manipulations you get with water content in terms of which microbes are doing what.
Yeah.
Like anaerobes slow, aerobes fast. Like it's kind of a nice, gentle way to bring people to.
That's true. Yeah. It was interesting to read the chapters about carbon sinks and carbon sources, and trying to see if you can tap agricultural soils as a carbon sequestering strategy. That's interesting to me. I don't know if people got to, there's a part towards the end where I think it might be the last chapter. Yes, it is. Which really, if you hadn't gotten to it, really reads to me a lot like kind of maybe what is it called, like a white paper, where you're kind of making a pitch. And one of the things she suggests is kind of developing a system to kind of certify and label certain products as being made in a soil friendly or soil safe approach. Kind of like, you could get labels for being organic or things like that. And kind of mobilizing the power of the consumer to drive incentives for adopting these practices. And that's an interesting idea, because I do think that works. Also not my wheelhouse, but I know there's a lot of work to think about, where sociologists and psychologists think about how you shift societal norms to adopt new things. So that's an interesting thing to consider.
feel like the other layer on that is, how do you support those growers to maintain soil safeness in the context of climate change too? Because I can see how this becomes a like, I mean, it is a very good idea, but it's also like the level of surveillance, the level of follow-up to make sure that whatever constitutes that stewardship is actually not drifting over time. So, and
some of it you can imagine there would be a lot of resistance. So it's just kind of one thing she mentions, but she mentions in here that you could get school systems for when they're providing meals like lunches to purchase kind of soil safe labeled foods. And I thought that's a great idea, but if it's remotely more expensive than what they're getting now, I just don't think it's going to happen, because schools are already scraping in terms of budgets. So that's a tough ask for them. But yeah, that's finding an incentive structure is an interesting thing.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, because it's not saying the R word, regulatory, right? I mean, people are doing all they can to not drive up costs through those pathways in a lot of cases. And like there is sometimes very good reasons for it, depending on the number of resources that you're starting with. I mean, in terms of like the subsistence of your business or whatever, but like, yeah.
It's a little bit, it maybe shouldn't be, but it's always surprising to me how, so here's an example, like the USDA is, in addition to the CDC and the FDA, are supposed to kind of monitor our food industries to make sure that they don't have common pathogens. But like, for example, the United States, in terms of our poultry industry and how bad salmonella is, it's really bad. So you would think that a federal agency whose mission is to regulate and monitor these things would just step in and say, I don't care what you do, but you've got to make sure that your levels of salmonella are below this. And it kind of hasn't happened. So it's I think there's kind of perhaps a unique regulatory structure in the United States compared to like European Union and other places that favors corporations and tries to kind of adopt an approach of having corporations make that shift on their own instead of getting forced into it through regulation, which has its own challenges, which is why consumer power can be really powerful in that way, because people start buying a different product or, so forth, then that's a way to get that incentive without regulators having to step in if they don't feel empowered to. I don't know. Oh, Joanna just posted something to the chat.
As a podcast, I think these farmers are Minnesota or Iowa, and it's I don't know, I think it's hopeful. And I think just actually by listening to farmers, right, you want to get to know the other, if that makes sense, right? And so rather than us just talk at this high level, like reading this book, policy, stuff like that, let's talk to the people that are on the ground that are suffering from depression because of the economic hardships of being a farmer. Let's talk to them about the continuing education they do, or listen to them, just listen in on them talking to each other. I think that's where we're going to actually learn more and be able to tell the story in a more convincing way. And so yes, books, yes, stats, but also people. I think people is huge.
Yeah, definitely, because you're right. There's a lot of agriculture is certainly not a monolith, and we've got a lot of people who are working hard within different constraints to try to. I think, Joanna, you made the point earlier that the farmers are very scientific about that. They have to be, otherwise they're almost they're not going to get the yields they need if they don't have a really thoughtful approach to how they're doing things. So that's a really excellent point, that there's a lot of people thinking hard about this on a day-to-day basis. Is there, I mean, I'm this is a very naive question. is there like a farmer's lobby or a farmer's union or a farmer's
100%.
professional organization? Or, I mean, I know there's a lobby that protects big agriculture, but is there like a independent farmers, or I don't know what you would call it.
I'm sure there is. I don't know how big or powerful it is, but
yeah. It is one of the big challenges of having a large population, is to have so many people separated, myself included, from how your food is produced. And then you start to kind of lose track of what's involved and what's at stake and the folks that are doing it.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm just curious if there's so we got a lot about we've now kind of had two books for folks that are read the other one, that kind of emphasized all the different ways that soil health can be affected in a negative way. I'm kind of curious about whether folks, was there anything in here that you felt like, okay, I didn't know about this, and this is making me kind of hopeful? It's unfortunate if I just asked that and nothing and everyone's like, no, I just was sad.
I just kept thinking, like, can we, like, all this runoff and sediment and stuff, can we like make soil? Like, I know you can't, like, it's like, can there be
but there's the anthrosols that were all mentioned in the last chapter.
Oh, yeah,
I need to read the last chapter, apparently, but I'm like, can we reverse this quickly? Like, you know, when I read about the earthworms or whatever in that first book, I'm like, how much, you know, how many years it takes to develop soil. I'm like, we can do that faster. So yeah, I guess I want to, you know, I felt kind of like this was a downer. Like, let's talk about what's possible. And I might not have gotten to it yet, right? But where's the hope? So tell me, where's the hope?
I mean, I think it's certainly the case that anthropogenic change has, we've very clearly shown that we can impact soil by impacting it in a negative way. So, I mean, that does indicate that if we can think through what we need and get the momentum to do it, it stands to reason that we might be able to kind of do something in the reverse. It's hard, right? Because you're trying to think about better stewardship is really the best long-term answer, but you kind of need a stopgap strategy to let that get established. One of the things that I think this book and the other book mentioned is that it's a perverse incentive, that doing things for the health of your soil can have such a delayed payoff that your year-to-year incentives kind of can potentially force you into a pattern that you might even recognize is not good for the long-term health of your soil, but you're kind of trapped in this, like, I have to do this season to season or year to year. So maybe there's some stopgap things that could be developed that would help offset the short-term cost while you're waiting for the long-term payoff. Yeah.
She talks about root system architecture. I mean, I think I'm actually just going to press return on the chat, but like, this is a very protracted lecture. I think this particular instructor's whole soil science course from Cornell is uploaded to YouTube, but 22 minutes into the video, he kind of starts with this definition of soil as a volume. And the reason this is kind of sticking out is back to your question about why microbes weren't sort of featured more closely, but something that I think was sort of masterfully done through omission is that Dr. Handelsman is not presenting exemplars that are a one size fits all. And in many cases, there's a very close focus on key elements of that ecosystem, as well as the fact that she's very clear that understanding the dynamics of a soil loss and soil gain aren't just going to be understood through those biotic components. The abiotic components are big. And she actually gives like half a chapter to like all the empirical methods for quantifying erosion, which in the majority of cases, like you are measuring an abiotic process, but we're also talking about like these nutrient pools that do interact with the biosphere itself. So you've got microbes. In some cases, she's talking about their sort of symbiotic associations or specific ecosystem services. The grassland stuff, which I routinely forget that there's like a lot of carbon that's potentially sequestered by some of these grasses that have large extended root systems, that she makes the point of compared to some other plant systems, that there's a very large component of biomass in there that again are producing all of those sort of soil structuring effects, possibly creating habitats and micro niches, possibly, you know, acting in ways that are creating all the heterogeneous nutrient pools and dynamics of water transport and nutrient transport that give us the taxon richness that we probably expect at the fungal and bacterial level as well. In addition to things like talking about agroforestry systems. So where does that definition of soil end? I know it's one of those very big philosophical questions, but it's like all these other parts of the volume. And they will all have to be understood in the context of like local regulatory forces, especially in the context of climate change. So like, I think the hope is that we've seen that we can choose to kind of figure out what paying attention to the land really means from people who've done it well. Because I think one of those latter chapters, do I want to drop a spoiler? But there's one about, there's legacies of soil stewardship that are mentioned towards the end of the book. And I think those are hopeful that like there are delayed payoffs. And we do have things like vertical farming and soil-free systems that have a lot of commercial development of, again, modified plants or things that, you know, in this case, you've got no spatial barriers to nutrient access. So maybe some of the stuff that's going to happen in more urban schemes or populations for where food has to be given is that combining some of these more mechanized cultivation systems while we wait for the payoff of soil stewardship might be the combinations. I don't know.
Yeah, this was, I liked this illustration, because this one was kind of demonstrating the root systems, the difference in the root systems between domesticated things like, you know, corn and like switchgrass, for example. And that's, you don't really think about what's going on so much underneath the layer that you can see the plant coming out of. And so that's an interesting idea to think kind of, oh yes, you know, we got this whole dynamic complex root system that we want to think about. And I thought it was interesting that, I don't know, for folks who got to it, there was some discussion, because Nicole mentioned there was some kind of discussion of different agricultural practices from different societies. And I do think it's interesting because I didn't have time to go back and look at the first book, but I think that the first book included the Maya as a society that collapsed because they didn't take care of their soil. And here she kind of directly addresses that and says, there's a lot of people who are now arguing that that's not accurate, that you know, their system of agriculture was well developed and well sustained, and it was other things that led to kind of what happened with Maya civilization. To me, that was just an interesting detail, because it kind of, with history and kind of how you interpret different evidence, it kind of a little bit depends on kind of what's your framework coming into it. And the first book was very keen to kind of demonstrate this is a thing that's happened to every civilization, like erosion of their soil is what led to the death of all of these civilizations. And this book is like, okay, it's not that extreme. You know, historically, we've had societies who had a good balance, who had figured out locally what worked for them. I think that's good. That I found that hopeful, because the first book was very much like everyone has destroyed themselves in this way. And this
Well,
book was like,
yeah, she was very, very careful and thorough. I mean, in terms of even the the distinction between slash and burn agriculture and then fire management that's using cooler temperatures.
Yeah.
To actually achieve some of that insoluble carbon pool, like that there was a deliberate strategy behind using it in some of these.
And I think there's I don't know if this is true, but I wonder if that's just a reflection in terms of the types of technology that's continued to develop in terms of how you analyze the data for this understanding soil health. And how I thought there was a bit where she talks about, I think it was in the Amazon, that just through, not on the ground, but actually I think it involves lasers, which I was like, when I read it, I was like, I don't know how that would work, like lasers. It's like back to Dr. Evil lasers. But there was a part in the book where she talked about how they've been able to identify areas that it's clear that some indigenous peoples had been invested in planting and growing and managing that area compared to other areas that had been traditionally or historically unmanaged, and that the quality of the soil and the depth of the topsoil layer and the organic matter was, notably different in the areas where those folks had been kind of adopting these practices. And I thought that was really interesting, that you're getting, with new tools and new ways of kind of doing surveys, you can identify evidence of past practices that were successful for those situations. I thought that was really neat.
I mean, it could be a substantive body of evidence, considering that the first book was published in 2007, but there's all this other stuff that's just revising a lot of, maybe absolutely, the dynamics of what was going on with these civilizations and how long some of their practices are persistent as a signature. Yeah.
And I mean, certainly there's been periods where you've had climate things happen that even a really well-tuned system is hard to kind of, if you get long periods of drought, there's even a well-developed, well-tuned system is going to have a hard time remaining robust during long periods of drought. But yeah, I was happy to see such a thoughtful discussion of other societies' approaches to soil. I really liked the kind of discussion of how the Maori think about their relationship with soil and their efforts to try to kind of reclaim their position with the land and get some of their approach kind of more well integrated into the way the New Zealand government approaches land stewardship. I thought that was really good to read about, and hopefully continues to go in the right direction. That would be a wonderful example. But, well, we're coming up on 4:30. Does anybody have any kind of closing thoughts about this particular book? Nope. All right. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. I really appreciate the opportunity to read this. I was telling my husband that the book club is great because otherwise I probably would have read half of a book this summer instead of the 3 books that I really wanted to read. So the next book that we're going to be discussing in August is about earthworms. And it's by Amy Stewart, who you might know from The Drunken Botanist. And she also actually writes a fiction series that's really fun called, at least the first book was called Girl Waits with Gun. So good author, you enjoy that. And that will be our August book. So hopefully folks can join us then.